Hello, everybody. So this is, I'm going to propose something to you, which is that I don't believe in masters. I don't believe in gods. I am very honored by this. But what I am going to propose is that I'm here today because some very generous artists shared their ideas with me. And I'll talk specifically about one in my presentation, and they handed that knowledge to me to carry forward. And I believe that in this room today is perhaps the future of cinema, and it's one of you. And so I'm going to share my knowledge with you, not because I'm a master, but because I was lucky enough to have that knowledge. And I'm going to ask you to carry it forward. That I've been to Mexico now 3 times in the last 18 months. And I think that Mexico perhaps can be the future of cinema. It can show the rest of the world what cinema can be, and that's up to you. So I'm placing that on you now. So I'm going to share as much as I can in this very brief period, and then I'm going to look forward to seeing the remarkable works that you'll produce in the future, you know, based on a lot of influences, maybe a tiny little bit from what I tell you today. Okay. So my entire practice has been concerned with the relationship between art and social change. What can films do? What can they not do? How can the world be transformed? I think we all know the world is pretty fucked up, right? Like, this is a knowledge we all have. And so one of the challenges for me is to find strategies that don't simply remind us how terrible it is, how many problems there are, but at least attempts to begin to work towards proposals of solutions. Because one thing I know is that every problem has a solution. If we haven't discovered it yet, that's our own limitations. We haven't worked together, we haven't found it, but it exists. There are no insurmountable problems. That includes violence, it includes war, it includes racism, and it includes climate change, which all of you are dealing with now. Like, your generation is going to have to deal with the inadequacies of my generation. And I'm sorry. I apologize on behalf of my old generation. And so my work is always concerned with this. So I want to show at the beginning a strange little clip. It's not a film. It's a clip from a moment in my life that I feel like embodied the challenges for me, which is, am I a filmmaker? Am I an activist? Am I both? Am I neither? Right? So this is like a strange little moment for that. So let me find my my clips here. All right. All right. I'm not getting that. Okay. All right. All right. Good. Now, first of all, I need to make sure that the playback is not going in order here. Okay. So, in 2006, something really strange happened in the United States. Right. There we go. And I'm going to bring up a little bit of audio here. So this is the streets of Los Angeles. In 2006, a social movement exploded very unexpectedly, and that was the immigrant rights movement. As is often the case, movements arise unexpectedly and triggered by things we don't expect them to. There's this old saying on the left is that revolutions are impossible until they happen, and then everyone says they were inevitable. And this is a kind of example of this, right? So in 2006, another repressive law against immigrants was attempted to be passed in Congress. And so in a series of places around the country, demonstrations occurred, large demonstrations against this law. And I forget even the name of this law. Every 5 years or so, there's another hateful racist law that attempts to be passed in the United States. And this was an example of one, right? And so what happened is that over the course of the next few weeks, day after day after day, these large demonstrations would take place in the downtown area of Los Angeles. Now, I don't know if you can get a sense from this image, but there were 1 million people marching on Broadway. So it went back like a mile. It's the largest group of people I've ever witnessed in my life. So I was at this event You know, I'm an old white dude. I'm at this event trying to offer help, trying to say that I'm with the people, that I'm against these racist laws, and I'm there as a kind of activist, right? I'm organizing the sound system, I'm handing out placards, I'm doing normal activist type things. But I had a camera with me too. So at a certain point in the demonstration, there is an opportunity basically to for me to film, and so I have a camera with me. So I rush up ahead of the crowd, and when I rush up ahead of the crowd, I place my camera at this funny angle, and I placed it on a newspaper box, so a box that was to sell newspapers. And herein lies what I'm describing as the entire dilemma of my whole career. Oh, thank you. Which is across the street. Okay, so one of the calls for the demonstration, which was on May Day, by the way. So this is May 1st, 2006. And May Day is not celebrated in the United States. I don't know if you realize this. The holiday originated in the United States, but it is not celebrated in the United States because of anti-communism and anti-socialism, which are a very profound part of American culture. Way back when. So the day called for a closure of all the businesses. So it was a kind of, all of the businesses would be closed in solidarity with this movement. And so as we're marching down the street, some of the businesses are open. You know, there's people standing outside selling jewelry, selling electronics. And some of the young activists start trying to convince the people to close the businesses, like to shut down. You can hear the chants going on. I'm not going to make it too loud because it will be very hard to hear me. And so I placed my camera on this newspaper box, and then, believe it or not, with all these people, I left the camera. So it's a strange moment where I was, you know, it was not an expensive camera, but still, probably not my best idea. Because I get so absorbed in what's happening across the street, the attempt to close these businesses. There's a group of young people who were doing it. They're chanting, they're standing in front. They weren't being aggressive, they weren't being violent, but they were being insistent. So I get drawn away from the camera, and I'm across the street trying to get the businesses to close one by one, and I forget about the camera altogether. So that's why this shot goes on and on, because it's running. It's an old camcorder. It's not a DSLR. It's not a fancy camera. And I am busy across the street, right? Well, meanwhile, I'm not making a film anymore, even though the camera's still running, because I'm across the street. And the point that I'm trying to make is, therein lies my dilemma. Am I there standing in front trying to shut down the business so that everyone will join the boycott and join this demonstration, which is so immensely important, or am I there to document? And this contradiction I've never resolved, and I don't propose to sit here and tell you that I know how to resolve it. The relationship between my work and work in the streets is a very complex one. And I really believe in my heart that if you wish to make change, you have to organize to make that change. And if you wish to make creativity, you have to dedicate yourself to that. So to find a balance between those two things, because the most important thing that I feel can be done politically is to give people the belief that they should continue to struggle, and that struggle will eventually produce change. And you now hear it, because we won. And one by one, each of the businesses closed. So that is the shot that I have never used in a film, but which is very interconnected to the whole dilemma of my practice. All right, so let's go back here. Whoops, sorry. I lost my playlist, but it's right there. Okay, whoops, and it started again. Okay, so this is probably going to happen a few different times. I wonder why it's doing that to me, but anyway, it's fine. Okay, so. Okay. All right, now, so I'd like to talk about where this sort of process began for me. It would be very inaccurate and dishonest to not acknowledge my family background. Right? My family background is a deeply interconnected part of my experience in activism and my concerns in the world. Okay, so I was born to a teenage mother who had come from Alabama. Alabama is a part of the deep American South. In fact, she not only was born in Alabama, but she was born in what is called Lower Alabama. And that may not mean anything to you, but if you were there, you'd immediately know what I mean. It's what we would think of as the Deep South. It's a place where even today, in 2019, the social relations feel like they're 150 years old, and where there is very little evidence of social progress, and there is a lot of decay. And she grew up in a place where her family was openly quite racist, in which it was assumed that you would be racist, and in fact that was the way that you showed that you were a good, upstanding citizen, in which, for example, when she was in high school, the Ku Klux Klan marched around her high school to protest the fact that 5 black students were going to enter the high school, right? And this is the world she grew up in. So as a teenager, she meets a man who's 5 years her senior, 5 years older than she is, and it's eventually my father, right, who has just returned from the Vietnam War, where he was a helicopter pilot, and he's actually a very decorated helicopter pilot. He was one of the most decorated pilots in the war, won the Distinguished Flying Cross, got something like 20 or 30 different medals for his conduct in the war, but he hated the war. The whole time he was there, he felt that he was an occupying force, that the Vietnamese didn't want him there, and that they believed in Ho Chi Minh. Something that he talked about over and over again was that they all referred to Ho Chi Minh as Uncle Ho, right? As like a family member that they looked up to. And so he came back not really sure what to do with this. He was still in the army, and he hated the war, and this was in 1966, so the war was still going to go on for a long time. And he meets this teenage girl from Alabama who hates racism, and the two of them kind of form an alliance, and they decide to leave the South together, and they go as far as they can. And meanwhile, my mother is pregnant with me. Like I said, she's just a teenager. And so I'm born in Colorado, not because we had any roots in Colorado, it's the American West, but because my mother and my father were fleeing the South because they were trying to escape from war and racism. So I grew up in a family where my ideas that I'm sharing with you today were normal, right? That war and racism were the twin evils of our home. And they became a kind of religion in my family. We didn't have religion, but we had that. And so everything in my childhood was reflected through war and racism. So the films that I make, they're just, in a way, completely consistent with the family that I grew up in. There's no great rupture with my family. So often, radical people are rebelling against their family, right? In the same way they're rebelling against their state, their teachers, so on and so forth. But in my case, that's not the case. It was actually a kind of loyalty to my family because I was so convinced from such an early age that they were right and that war and racism were not inevitable, to the contrary, and that they could be ended and they could be transformed. And I still believe these things very much. And so that's the foundations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how I end up as a filmmaker all of these years later. So I find myself in the early 1990s traveling to Cuba on a regular basis. I ended up going there several times. Why? Well, because I grew up in this home and think about these things, well, I'm going to step backwards and tell you a little story that tells you something about the United States. So my first day of first grade in a public school in Denver, Colorado, where I grew up, the little old lady, Mrs. Scott was her name. This is the first time I have said her name aloud in decades, and so I hope her ghost is not unsettled by my speaking ill of her. She sits us all down on the floor, and she says to us, "You know there's an evil place in the world where no one believes in God, and it's called Russia." Okay. Well, you can imagine I'm a little kid. I'm in my first day of first grade. And that, first of all, that's already telling you how much xenophobic propaganda exists within U.S. society. Like that you would be taught this on the first day of school. It's all the time. So I hear this, and because I'm growing up as a 6-year-old with parents who tell me that religion is not a good thing and that we don't need religion, I'm already thinking, like, what is going on here? And so I go home and I talk to them about it, and they explain to me a little bit about anti-communism and its relationship to the Vietnam War. And so all of this stuff starts to develop in my head. And so when I'm a teenager, when I'm 18 and I'm in college, I apply for a fellowship to go to the Soviet Union because I want to see it myself. So all those years later, I'm still thinking about this woman trying to convince me that people are evil in another country, right? Well, so this is a big part of why I go to Cuba. So then I take a class when I'm in college. I take a class on new Latin American cinema. It's now like my Bible, right? It's like everything to me. I can't even imagine my life without that cinema. But I'm seeing things for the first time that are just like, oh my God. And one of the things I see Cuban cinema. So I see Memories of Underdevelopment by Tomas Gutierrez Zelaya, right? And I see this film, and I think, there is no way that Cuba can be the country that I have been told it was if they make this movie, right? It's impossible. And so I decide, in college, I'm going to start trying to figure out a way to go to Cuba, just like I went to the Soviet Union. And so I start going over and over again. And the first time I go to work on an organic farm. I'm not going there to make movies or anything like that. I go to work on an organic farm because I have a trip I can go down and I can contribute to this farm. And the organic farm is next to the film school. So it's just location. And so I start meeting people from the film school and having conversations about Cuban cinema. And it's so interesting to me, right? And I start thinking, well, these ideas seem like they could be applied in other places at other times. They don't seem specific to Cuba. And so then I decide to go back and maybe try to work on a movie. Like, I don't have any training. I don't know what I'm doing, but someone gives me a high 8 camera that I can borrow for a few months, and my family has a Super 8 camera that we used, and so I take those cameras down with me. And when I'm there, I'm at the Copelia, the famous ice cream parlor, right? And I end up in another conversation with the man in front of me who works at the Cuban Film Institute. And he thinks it's weird that this American in his 20s is so interested in Cuban cinema. And he says, who would you like to meet? You need to meet some people. And I immediately ask for Titon, who's dying of cancer. I'm unable to meet him, of course. And he says, well, who else would you like to meet? And for some reason at this moment, and I don't even know why, I say Santiago Alvarez, who I had never seen any films by. So why does this happen, right? It's because I had read his name in manifestos, right? He always would come up. So Fernando Solanas and Octavio Guitino wrote their manifesto, and they say he's one of the only real filmmakers in the world. And I'm always wondering, who is this person? What are his films like? So I call him. I get his phone number. I call him. And the next day is his 77th birthday. And so he says, why don't you come over to my house and have birthday cake with me, right? It's hard not to feel sometimes like there's fate, right? And all of this seems really interconnected. So I go over to his house. I share birthday cake with him. It's a nice party. There's dancing. You know, Cubans are wonderful at all these things. Very hospitable. And as I'm sitting there with him, I suddenly just say, this is the movie I need to make. I need to make the movie about this guy. So I ask him, can I make a movie about you? And then he asks me, well, how many of my films have you seen? I lied. I said one. But I hadn't seen any. Okay, so even the one was a lie. But he says, okay, you can't. He says, I don't think you should make a movie about me if you haven't seen my films. So let's watch the films together, and then let's talk about it again. And so what unfolds over the next 2 months is my film education, at least my initial film education. And so for 2 months, we just sit there and we watch like 50 or 60 of his films. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are weird and strange and out of date. It's a whole range. Some of them, by the way, are very long. We think of his films as short, but some of them are. I watched one film that's like 5 hours long. He made both the longest films in Cuban film history and the shortest films in Cuban film history. So he did both. But the key is that I learned very quickly that what he's doing is making a different kind of film. He's making film that's operating on a couple of different levels. One, it's highly experimental, but two, it's highly political. And we tend to separate those things out, right? I mean, usually experimental films are apolitical, and usually political films are formally quite conservative, right? This is often the case. I mean, it's typically the case even now. And I start to realize something really important, which is that you can't express a new idea unless you express it in a new way. That people don't hear it. It doesn't penetrate through all of these things that we've built up, all of these restrictions, unless we're finding new ways to express it. And over and again, I'm watching this. Now, what's important to understand about Santiago is that the reason he came to this form had to do with the way that he was working. That I'm convinced that labor determines form in many ways. It determines social relations. It determines relationships between men and women. It determines relationships between the rich and the poor, the labor that's involved. And so his labor is that he doesn't start filmmaking until he's in his 40s. I don't know if you know this about Santiago Alvarez, but he had not made a film until he was in his 40s. And he's asked personally by Fidel Castro to make a radical newsreel because right after the revolution, there are a bunch of conservative newsreels that are American anti-communist newsreels operating in Cuba, but there's no radical newsreel. So he can trust Santiago politically. He has no film experience, and he'd been a journalist, so he asks him to make these films. And he has to make a film every week, right? Imagine this, right? And so over the course of the next 40 years, he makes 700 films. And in that making films and making them quickly and making them cheaply, he finds an entirely new form. And he finds a form that's engaged with reality, that is concerned with everyday problems and grand problems both at the same time, but comes out of this weekly work. And because he only has a week to make each film, he doesn't have time to overthink them. He's not imagining how will this film be screened in Mexico decades later, right? He's not thinking about that. He's thinking about the film that's going to be shown in cinemas before a feature right away, right? It's going to be the thing that's going to be shown immediately in Cuba. It's a very strange way of working, and it's a very unusual way, and it transforms his practice. And so to me, this is like a huge revelation, and I imagine this is the kind of work I want to do. Now, talking again about labor, I also don't quite process something when I'm watching these films with Santiago, which is how in the world am I going to make a living doing this kind of work? Because I'm living in the United States, and there's no state support, there's no infrastructure of comrades to work on this stuff, and I'm going to have to work fairly isolated, making films that in the United States are kind of hostile to the state, and so it has a very different relationship. But I'm in my 20s, I'm not worrying about that at that point. So I'm witnessing the future, and I'm seeing these films, and part of the reason they speak to me, actually, goes back to what I said to begin with, because they're about the things in my life. They're about the Vietnam War. They're about racism. So it's this strange experience where I'm in a place that seems so disconnected from my world, but in fact it's deeply connected to my world. That he's engaging with the very things that I need to engage with in my practice. Okay, so let's see. Why does it keep doing that? I want to see. Okay. Okay, perfect. So, So I'm going to show you just a little piece that explains kind of my experience of what these films actually did. This is from... So this is from the film that I made all those years ago.
On my way home from Cuba, I was detained for...
Sorry, the audio is very bad.
...by U.S. Customs in Chicago. Most of the questions they asked had to do with money. The who, the what, the where, but especially the how much. To most of them I gave the same answer. I believe I have the right not to answer that question. But when the agent asked why I'd gone to Cuba, I said, to see it with my own eyes. He never asked me what I saw, and so I never had the chance to tell him about the 50 films I saw. If he'd asked me, I would have told him that they were always political, and that they were often didactic, that they could be playful or deadly serious, that they were born of rage, bitter irony, and an almost limitless spirit of solidarity, that they could be raucous or silent, brief or monumental, laconic or verbose. They were prone to tangents, but they could be as eloquent as poetry. They never sought perfection, they were never made with posterity in mind. They showed the world to be forever changing and changeable, and they were always made for the here and now. Santiago made his films using every means at his disposal. Often this meant they were made with next to nothing at all. Give me 2 photos, music and a movie over, he said, and I'll give you a movie. And what a movie would be.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause this. So, what I'm talking about, it's hard to hear because this is a primitive early film and the audio is very poor quality. It's not the sound system, it's the film. So when I'm coming back from this trip, I get arrested in Houston because it's against U.S. law to travel to Cuba. It's not against Cuban law; they welcome it, but it's against U.S. law. So that's when this conversation unfolds. But the last point is the most important point, which is that I'm talking about politics, I'm talking about engagement, I'm talking about all these things, but what he taught me that was the single most important lesson, which has been relevant in every single film I've made, is about resources. Because when you live in the United States, and I'm sure it's true here to a great extent, but I think it's even worse in the US, there's a belief that you come up with an idea for a film, and then you seek the resources you need to make that idea the way in which you imagine it. Okay, and usually that means that you chase money for years, and filmmaking is so much about begging all of the time. Like, you beg for money to make the film, and then you beg for money to finish the film, and then you beg someone else to show the film, and then you beg someone else to distribute the film. Right? It's all this like series. It's always this power relationship that never really ends. And what I thought was so remarkable about Santiago, and he was so brilliant about, is that he would invert this basic pattern, right? He would say, not what resources do I need to make that film? He'd say, what resources do I have? And how do I then make the film with the resources that I have? Now, for someone like me who's working in the US, and to be frank, things are not easy for me there economically. I'm so lucky, and I'm not complaining about my life. But I don't get the opportunities that many other people who have shown as much and made as much as I do get because of the nature of the films. Like, I don't want to say that I'm blacklisted, but I'm gray-listed, right? Like, I'm in this area where it's hard for me to get these opportunities. So what? So what? Who cares? Let them worry about their pitch sessions and finding the money and all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to keep making work. So every time I try to find a strategy where I start with that lesson he taught me, was what do I have? What do I have available to me? So for every film, it's always getting back to that question of what do I have available to me? Okay, so then I make this film. It ends up showing more than it should have for a primitive early film, because unfortunately when I finish it, he dies. So as I'm completing the film, Santiago Alvarez dies at the age of 79. It's peculiar because his most beautiful and important film is called The 79 Springtimes of Ho Chi Minh, because Ho Chi Minh dies at 79. It's funny how all of these things echo. It also probably means, realistically, I will also die at 79. Okay. Let's just be real about this. I mean, if there's any poetry in the world, I've got 29 years left. I better make use of them. So then I decide, okay, well, what do I have available to me now? Because this film ends up showing as part of tributes to him and all of this kind of stuff, simply because of timing in the world. And I'd never imagined I would be a filmmaker, to be honest, but suddenly I am a filmmaker, so I decide, okay, I'm going to make another film. What do I do? Well, I think about what's available to me again. And the first thing I do is I think about where I grew up. So I told you I was born in Denver, and I grew up for the first 10 years of my life in Colorado. And then in my the next decade, my parents moved from Colorado to Montana, which is further north. I don't know how much you know about the geography of the U.S., but the Rocky Mountains cut through the sort of, the left section of the country, middle section, right? And they cut all the way down from the Canadian border all the way down to the Mexican border almost. That's where they go. And it's this remarkable mountain range. And my parents, I think in part because my father was so traumatized from war, kind of wanted to avoid people. And so he kept moving further north where there's fewer and fewer people. And we end up in Montana. And we end up in Montana for this reason that initially it's because he wants to live in this beautiful place and he loved skiing. He has all these very basic dreams. But because he can't find work in the place he wants to live, we end up in this other town, which is Butte. And Butte is this really, really strange town in the U.S. West. There aren't very many parallels. It's in the middle of a state. Montana is the northernmost Rocky Mountain state. And it's a spectacular and beautiful place, but it's also really messed up in many ways. So, for example, you really feel the weight of the attempted extermination of the indigenous population. You feel the weight of giant military bases because it's where the nuclear warfighting abilities are mostly focused, is in Great Falls. And there's hundreds of nuclear missiles in Montana and missile bases. One little side note is that have you ever heard of this term nuclear preppers, or apocalypse, people who are trying to build a place where they'd be safe from nuclear war? They all move to Montana because there are no people there, and yet Montana will be hit by hundreds of nuclear missiles because there are so many nuclear missiles there. So it's the worst possible place to move if you're trying to avoid nuclear war, even though there's no people there. But that's just a side note. Okay, so we move up there, and we end up in Butte, and Butte is beautiful and horrible. Butte is a town that is, if you go there, it's the nicest people you'll ever meet. It is weirdly spectacular, but it's also apocalyptic because the world's largest open pit copper mine is in the center of the town. So Butte is an industrial town. It's a post-industrial town. And when we moved to Butte, the mine is shutting down. And so everybody's leaving when we're coming in. And the town is in a kind of depression. The economy is a disaster. It's a city that used to have like 150,000 people. There's only 30,000 people. So it feels like a ghost town, even though there's still people who live there. And so the whole time I'm living there, I know that it used to be a very important city. It actually was the largest city in the American West in the late 19th century. So all the way from Chicago to San Francisco, it was the most important city. And now it's like a weird ghost town. And so I think I need to figure out what happened. How did this city go from being so significant to being in this terrible state? Okay, so I start thinking about an urban legend in Butte. And if you grow up in Butte, partly the way that I did, there's different stories that people tell. And one of them at that time was that there was a very famous radical organizer who came to Butte in 1917. And his name was Frank Little. And he was an organizer for the industrial workers of the world. And the IWW it still exists, and it's still somewhat active, but it's very small. During the period of World War I, it was incredibly important in the United States. It was the force that the police were terrified of, the state was terrified of, because it sought to organize all of the workers who had not been organized. They called it one big union, and it was a radical union that called for the abolition of capitalism. And that their strategy, this was before the Russian Revolution, so their strategy was that the general strike would overthrow capitalism. Okay, so during World War I in Butte, Butte is very important to the war effort for the United States. Why? Because copper is essential to the war drive. Copper is essential to the war drive because of the way because of its connection with electricity and all the factories that are producing the weapons, but also there's a very direct reason, which is that bullets at that time all have copper in them. So it's said that every single bullet fired by every single American gun in World War I had copper from the Butte mines. So they need to keep these mines going. But in the middle of 1917, there's a terrible fire in Butte, and almost 200 miners are burned up in the fire. The work conditions are really terrible. And so the whole town has a giant general strike in this town. It's one of the most important labor actions in U.S. history. The fire was called the Speculator Fire, ironically, the Speculator Mine. And so different organizers come from all over the country. They descend on the town because this massive event is unfolding. And one of them is this guy named Frank Little. And Frank Little is a very mysterious figure in U.S. history. We still don't know very much about him. But he was a leader of strike after strike after strike. He's an infamous person who's arrested dozens of times, multiple times is nearly murdered. Right before he comes to Butte, he's in the Iron Range of Minnesota, and he's taken out of town and dumped in a ditch with a noose around his neck to tell him that if he comes back to town, they're going to kill him, right? But he's a fearless man, so he comes to Butte. And he arrives in this very contested space. And try to imagine this if you can. It's Butte, Montana, in the middle of a massive strike that the entire country is looking at, and everyone is worried about, and everyone wants to know how it unfolds. And they invite him to speak at these giant events. Okay, there's no microphone, right? There's no electrical system, so he's speaking to 5,000 or 10,000 people with his voice. And he doesn't just say, "Let's win the strike." He gets up at the height of the war effort, and he says, "Let's overthrow the system," right? Like he takes it really far in a very dangerous place. That's a very violent place. And you can guess what happens to him, right? The organizers, the owners of the mine, which was the Anaconda Company, and the Anaconda Company was the most powerful corporation in the world. They basically decide it's time to kill Little. We have to kill this guy. Which brings us to this question. They kill him. And his death somehow seems to me interconnected with the future of the town. And so this is the film I make. So I talk about what resources are available to me. The resources that are available to me is this inside knowledge of a town that somehow is interconnected to the rest of the world, even though that town is forgotten. And so the next film I make deals with that, and that's called An Injury to One. So let me show you a little piece of that film. I don't know what happened there. Hold on. Oh yeah, here we go. It's still showing. Hold on. Let me go backwards. I'm going to start it over. Hold on. There we go. Pretty sure it's coming. Yeah. Now, the challenges I face on this film are kind of interesting, and it's one of my first films I've ever had to work this way, right? Which is that I'm confronted with the fact that there's not that much information left, right? That the documents have all been destroyed, the police files are all erased, information about the murder is erased, the coroner's report is erased, everything's burned, everything's destroyed. And part of me was very frustrated and felt like, well, I wanted an answer to this question: what happened in the murder, and what did that murder have to do with the future of the town? But what I discovered was this lesson of Santiago's again, right? Which is that I looked at the resources I had available to me, and I could solve the problem. And the resources I had available to me was I had the landscape first and foremost. I had a destroyed place. And that destroyed place kind of told me everything I needed to know. And then I had little fragments of documents. I had songs. I had little narrative accounts. I had a handful of photographs. And the relationship between those things was everything that I needed. And in fact, I was able to make a fairly, dare I say, articulate film about the circumstances of that town and what had happened. And the film traces kind of mostly the past, and then at the very end connects it to the future, the present and the future. The film ends with something which, if I had 5 hours, I would show you a fragment of, but I'm going to have to move ahead, which is that the ecological disaster in the town is now a profound one. There is a giant open pit in the town, and it has almost a mile deep of water, and that water is very toxic. So the water is full of chemicals, and the water is full of metals. And this kind of hovers over the town, and every so often birds land in the water and they die. And so the film ends with a story of 300 of the birds dying in one incident. So 300 of them land in a storm, because geese in a storm their instinct is to land on water and wait the storm out. So they all land on this lake, and the next morning there's like 350 of these dead animals floating in the water. So that's the way the film ends. The town doesn't end that way because it's still there. And so last year, 4,000 geese died in the lake. So 4,000 animals, then it's just like this apocalyptic thing. The reason I bring it up is because what ends up happening actually is something that I was not wise or smart, but was a coincidence, which is that the film interconnects the repression of the labor movement with the future ecological problems. And I'm convinced that this is something that all of you are facing now, right? Which is that we are now in this kind of apocalyptic crisis of the ecology in the world, and that it's interconnected to the fact that working people have been so dispossessed from power that they cannot contribute to the shaping of the society. That it's only people from above who have shaped the entire organization of society. So this was, again, it was not a wisdom on my part. It was a set of circumstances. So again, the labor produces the ideas, and I think that's an extremely important notion. So I ended up making, at that point, a series of, I made other films in Butte, and if we had a longer period of time, I would share the very strange story of my subsequent film. I made a fiction film about Butte after this that was entirely concerned with the contemporary reality. What the hell? I don't care how much time we have. I'm going to show you the ending of it. So the film is called Who Killed Cock Robin, and the film is... It's a funny movie. I end up showing it. So at this point, my films are starting to screen a little bit. And so Who Killed Cock Robin shows in the main competition at Sundance for some reason. They have this idea they should, which was a terrible idea for everyone. And the film is greeted with unbelievable hostility. So imagine that right now in this theater, I'm starting to talk, and then 80% of you walk out in the next 30 seconds. And that's what happened at my screenings the entire time. Why this is a complex question, but so I present the film in this place, and the film kind of disappears, although later it's rediscovered elsewhere. But I think the reason is because fundamentally the film was about everyday reality in Butte, and it made people uncomfortable. And so the story came out of a real incident, which was that a young man in Butte shoplifted a six-pack of beer. So he did what teenagers, young people do all the time. He doesn't have enough money to drink one night, and he tries to grab some beer in a convenience store, and he gets arrested. And that arrest triggers his complete destruction in life, and within a week he murders his landlord, right? And this story just struck me as a way to articulate the reality of this town, that doing something so simple could have such catastrophic effects for you. Like a simple human error could destroy your entire life and other people's lives too. And somehow this seemed very connected to the truth of the town. And so I assembled a group of people, and we made this film very collaboratively. It's all handheld, it's all chaotic. It's definitely a kind of neo-realist film. This is the end of it. So this is after he has, let's see where I have it right now, actually. I'm not sure where the sequence that I have lined up is, but I want to make sure that so this is the very end of the film. So this is the very end of the film, and at this point what's happening is that this young man has been evicted from his home, he's lost his job, and it's all again triggered by this very banal thing, which was shoplifting. And at this point he had a friendship with his landlord, and so he's kind of stalking his landlord. He's been cast out by his friends. And his landlord is a guitar player, because the actor that I used is actually a guitar player. So at this moment in the film, he is trying to decide what he's going to do to this person that he feels like somehow has evicted him and destroyed his life.
There ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. There ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. When you hear that trumpet sound, you gotta get on out of the ground. There ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. Well, I was lost Lost, but now I'm found. I was lost. Lost, but now I'm found. When you hear that trumpet sound, you gotta get on out of the ground. I was lost. I was lost, but now I'm found. Will my Savior gonna come down through the clouds? Will my Savior gonna come down through the clouds? When you hear that trumpet sound, you gotta get on out of the ground. When my Savior gonna come down through the clouds, there ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. There ain't no grave gonna hold my body down. When you hear that trumpet sound, you gotta get on out of the ground. There ain't no grave gonna hold my body down.
So? What?
What am I supposed to do, Charlie?
When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well?
So, just talking a little bit about, because I probably haven't talked enough about method. So this film was a little bit different, which is that we did it very collectively. So we lived in a house together. The music that you were hearing, except for the last little fragment, which is an incredible song from Silver Mount Zion, when the world is sick, can't no one be well, but I dreamt we were all beautiful and strong, which I think is one of the most incredible lines in a song I've ever heard. But we lived in the house together. The musicians recorded the music in back of the house, and it was highly collaborative and highly collective. There was no cinematographer. We passed the camera to people, so there were no specific roles. And it was really an attempt to make a kind of very radically different organized film from the way that I normally work. And we used only consumer-level technology, so very cheap video cameras at the time. But the problem was that in the U.S., it described a future because Butte was ahead of where the U.S. was going. The economy had already collapsed and the ecology was already destroyed. It made people very uncomfortable, and they all thought that it was a very pessimistic film. One of the main arguments in the film, which was shot in 2003, is that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq will still be going on 10 years later. And everybody said that that was an absurdity and that we were being pessimistic. So just goes to show. The consequence of that film, though, honestly, for me, was that I wasn't given any more money to make films for many, many years. It was a very destructive film for my career, which I was completely taken aback by. And so I had to put into practice these very questions that I described earlier about having very limited resources and working with limited resources, because I couldn't get any resources for a long time. And in fact, I didn't make anything that even approximated a fiction film for another 10 years. So I work in both documentary and fiction, and they're very interconnected for me. All of my fictions have a documentary element like this, and all of my documentaries have a kind of narrative storytelling in them. But it was a challenge, and so I'm gonna go ahead and leap ahead. I made a series of films, but I want to leap ahead to the most recent works, one of which I know that some of you have seen, and so I want to show a little fragment of, and in fact actually has subtitles, because I think it's useful for this discussion. So imagine that I want to make another fiction film, and for several years I was very shy about it, and I felt very pessimistic about it myself. And then years later I decided, why can I not make a fiction film exactly the same way I make my documentaries, which is with a simple camera, that I'm going out into the landscape, I'm shooting by myself. If I have help, I have help. If I don't, I just do it myself. And why can't I make a fiction film this way? I say this to all of you as well. We have a notion that if we're going to make fiction, it has to look like films that we think are fiction films. That's just bullshit, trust me. It's not true. We can work exactly as modestly as we have and make something beautiful and make something strong. And so after a few years of making more documentaries and making a series of films that, again, dealt with family history and landscape and places that I'd lived, I was living in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, I found a challenging place to make films, not because it was particularly hard in terms of the actual making of films, but the weight of Hollywood upon me, right? In a place that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films made, feeling like, what could I say that was new? What could I say that was original? How could I operate in this landscape and make something that was distinct? So it took me years. I lived in Los Angeles for, 10 or 15 years before I finally made a film there. Then I made a documentary there, and then I thought, no, I'm not going to be defeated by the absurdity of what happened at Sundance with this film, which was very hard and very distracting. It's hard to explain what it's like to be in the center of the independent film world and the target of all of the criticism and all of the humiliation. It's like even now I can Google it, and it's pretty entertaining to read what people said about this film. And so to turn away from that and to say, no, you were mistaken, and I still believe in this, and I can make this work, was a real act of faith on my part. And so for me, I made this film, Machine Gunner Typewriter, which existed at the intersection between fiction and documentary. It was made in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, what do I have available to me? Same thing. What are my resources? The resources I had available to me was I had my DSLR, which was a Canon 5D Mark II, which I'd had for several years. I had an apartment that was very modest and funny things on the wall in my apartment. But I also had this knowledge of this remarkable landscape of Los Angeles, which is weird and dark and complex. And what I discovered as I started to shoot films in Los Angeles is that it was actually really easy to shoot films in Los Angeles despite Hollywood, because Hollywood just shoots the same crap over and over and over again. And so the giant amount of the city is largely hidden, right? So for example, East LA, which is the predominantly Spanish-speaking part of the city, is only in a movie in some kind of condescending way about the Spanish-speaking population, right? There's no actual engagement with that part of the city, and that's the part of the city that I lived in. So right away, just shooting most of the film in East LA already gave me lots of originality and lots of different ideas. Also, shooting downtown from the east. Everybody who makes films lives on the west because they're rich, so they're always shooting downtown from the west. So all you had to do is just reverse it, and suddenly it looked totally different. And all of these things were kind of interesting to me. But the most powerful thing I had was a series of these places in Los Angeles that I could go to that were really interesting and that told stories about violence, racism, and the hidden history of the city, which was powerful and interesting, right? And so I thought, well, how can I create a fictional idea about these things where I can go to these places and that somehow engages an audience, but still allows me to do this kind of landscape documentary in the context of a fiction film. So I made up a story that's like, in a way, a kind of film noir cliche about a disappeared woman and a man searching for her, but I tried to frame it in this new way. And the idea that I had was that I also had this little radio transmitter, a pirate radio, an illegal radio transmitter, because I would periodically do illegal radio broadcasts. And so I thought, imagine if that was the starting point, that I was doing an illegal radio broadcast. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe the radio broadcast was directed towards one person. It was directed towards the woman who had disappeared. So I started trying to find ways to create an organizational structure for the film that would actually allow me to do the things that I wanted to do, but frame it in a language of genre that would open up that film. So at this point in the movie, it's fairly early on, and it's essentially a character who is recounting his relationship with this person over a radio broadcast that happens in the middle of the night in an attempt to find her, because he had initially found her through the radio. He was doing a radio broadcast, and she contacted him, and that's how they became friends. And the idea is that somehow, by recreating this broadcast, he'll discover her again. So I'd just like to watch a little bit of this, because I think, again, it somehow, it's interconnected to a faith that you actually can produce strong work with extremely limited resources if you're just thinking of those resources creatively enough. So this is sort of early in the film, and kind of takes us to a certain place in that film. Hold.
Of your revolution.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
And outside in the streets, I'm fumbling for my keys.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna add the subtitles back because they left and I have them right here. So hold on one second, then you can at least understand my mumbling. Okay.
Kissing again. And we kissed for so long. And my lips are still red and sore the next morning. And then we see that there's a coyote watching us the whole time. We go to the oldest museum in the city. We stare at all the immortal animals. Conquest taxidermy. I can't tear myself away from the buffaloes. There's this coyote upstairs with a house cat in his mouth. Down in the basement, in a nearly empty room, we stop in front of a redwood tree, and you say something in German. I didn't even know you could speak German. And you point at the bench towards the circles in the wood. And you say, "This is where I stood. And this is the size of the blast I set off."
So I would love to show along more of this because this is actually a film I'm very fond of, and part of the reason I'm fond of it is that I feel like, again, it was a blow against pessimism, right? It's a dark film, right? It's a very dark film. But for me, it was a light film because it was a film of me showing that you couldn't stop me from doing something that you tried to stop me from doing. Right, I made a fiction film. But it taught me something else, and it's something that I think is of use to filmmakers who are just developing their practice, which is that storytelling, we tend to associate storytelling with Hollywood filmmaking. And we tend to think of principles of storytelling in terms of the language that Hollywood uses, a 3-act structure, a very traditional structure. And I think that those ideas are very useful, but I think they're also framed by commerce. So I think certain ideas of storytelling come from an attempt to sell something to the largest number of people in the greatest number of countries. Like it's a commercial thing. However, we shouldn't resist storytelling as a fundamental human need, which is part of the way that we all make sense of the world is through stories and the way we tell stories and the way we share stories from generation to generation to generation. It's extremely important. And to resist storytelling in films is wonderful. And I love abstract films. I love films that completely move away from stories. But you do it at your own risk, right? It does alienate an audience in a way that framing things in the context of a story can really open up the discourse. So I made 2 films in a row in Los Angeles, and one had very little storytelling and was about events, and the second was framed by a genre. And the second showed much more widely and allowed me the opportunity to express myself politically more ferociously because it was framed in the context of a story. And that was very powerful to me, right? So the next film I made after this was the same kind of thing. I wanted to investigate a family story, and that family story was that my great-grandfather, his name was S.E. Branch, was a racist murderer who murdered several people and got away with it. And I wanted to investigate one murder in particular, which was the murder of a man named Bill Spann. And I wanted to figure out what had happened to that family, why he had been charged with murder and then the charges disappeared. I'm talking about my relative. And significantly, what the consequences for each family were. Were there consequences to my family? Were there consequences for the family of the murdered? And so I worked on this film, Did You Wonder Who Fired the Gun, for on and off for 3 or 4 years. But I framed it, okay, again, so this issue, I framed it as a kind of Southern Gothic, right? So a kind of spooky, noirish story. And that allowed me to push things fairly far politically. I find that storytelling and music are 2 strategies that can be used very badly. They can destroy films, but they can also open up the film for audiences and create space for us to say things more powerfully and more aggressively through those strategies. And so I worked on this film for a long time, and this is the most recent film that I finished. Let me just really quickly here, I want to add, I want to add the subtitles into this again. Why is that not there? Huh, that's weird. Okay. Hold on. Let's see, how about this one? Nope. Okay. No, neither of them are there. Let's see. Yeah, I want to be able to talk a little bit at the end, so I think a lot of you have probably cast eyes on that film anyway. So for some reason, it's not finding the file, and I want to just keep rolling along. So that film was an extremely weird experience for me overall, because what I discovered is 2 things. That when you make a film about how your own family has a racist murderer in it and you're condemning that person, that basically everyone wants to see that film and talk about it, but then it also makes people very angry with you. And it's not even just that it makes conservatives angry, and I did have an experience with that. I made the initial version of the film, and the way that I presented, at least a kind of hybrid of it here in Mexico this week, is a kind of live performance where I'm sharing elements of it. But what's interesting is that when I first did that performance, that people would stand up and they'd walk to the edge of the stage and they would tell me while I was doing it why they hated the film. So literally in a live context, which is very fascinating. And what I found is that somehow that whether people are conservative or whether they're liberal, that kind of having an openness about your relationship to racism and being direct about it makes people extremely uncomfortable. That in the United States, that race is something that kind of shapes everything, but somehow, in some bizarre way, people still ignore. and they still don't actually speak about it in a kind of honest way or a kind of direct way. And so this is like a weird reality that I've been coping with. Hold on here. Oh wait, maybe it's down here on this bottom side. Let me see what happens if I try this. Oh, clean up. Okay, let's see what happens here. Nope, still not there. Okay, we're not going to worry about it. So, because I want to be able to talk at the end, I want to talk about what I'm working on right now, because it's all the same set of concerns. So, what I've been doing of late is that I've been working on this film that is about a kind of intersection of all the same things that I'm interested in, which is that because I grew up in the American West, the infrastructure of nuclear war was everywhere. The American West is filled with so many elements of nuclear war you can't even believe it. And I was also interested in this question of what is the relationship between all of these places where there's nuclear missiles, which, by the way, are pointed at you, they're pointed at everyone, and the extermination or attempted extermination of the indigenous population of the American West. And what I discovered over and over again is that places that are associated with massacres of Native Americans are also the places that nuclear weapons are now. And this was like an important revelation in the process for me, because what I realized is that lands that were seized at the barrel of the gun in the United States are now permanently militarized, and the barrel of the gun now is pointed at everyone. And so I wanted to make this film in which I explored these questions. And so I came up with this very strange idea, which was that my family and I would go on a journey nationally, and we would drive from the East Coast all the way to California, and then all the way up through the North, and then back to the East Coast. And we would visit as on a family. Americans love road trips. It's like a very American thing to take summer road trips. And so we did a summer road trip with a little RV, but we just went to nuclear sites. And so I took all these little kids to the nuclear sites. And it was, and I'm really glad people are laughing, because I thought of it as a comedy. I really did. I thought it was a kind of comedic gesture. And I thought that comedy would allow something so overwhelming as nuclear war to open up. Again, like I talked about storytelling, and I talked about music as opening up discourse. And I thought, well, it's interesting because it seems like comedy would do the same thing. As the shoot developed, I think that the comedy diminished because I was so horrified by what I saw. And so we went to, I've filmed 25 different nuclear missile silos in the last 2 months. I've filmed nuclear test sites. I went to Los Alamos, where the weapon was created. I went to place after place after place. And it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. So you go to a nuclear missile silo, and if you can imagine this, it's surrounded by a fence. There's no security at all, honestly. Like, it's weird how where there's security in the United States, which is immense, and then where there's not. Nuclear missiles are completely undefended. And so you go to these silos, and inside, so there's a fence around it, and then the silos have really strange names. So each missile has a name, and the missiles are named after people, the missiles are named after celebrities, senators. And it's like, but they're also named after, like, so some of the silos are named things like crying children or famine. Right, like, just really strange. There's something very bizarre in all this. And so I would go to these sites. But I also went to Los Alamos, where the weapon was developed. And that's going to take me to the little fragment that I want to show you, because it's so bizarre. Because I want to share a story with you that tells you the kind of dilemma of the film for me. So the story about the development of the nuclear bomb, I don't know how much you know about this. Obviously, generationally, it's a thing. During World War II, the U.S. started the Manhattan Project, and the Manhattan Project was designed to develop a nuclear weapon. And the argument for it was that the Nazis were going to get a nuclear weapon, and if they got the nuclear weapon, they'd destroy the world, right? They'd take over, they'd use it to destroy the world. So they developed this nuclear weapons program in direct response to the Nazis. But there's a historical event that we now know is true. It's weird and it's unsettling, but it's entirely true, which was that by the time the U.S. started the Manhattan Project, the Germans had already abandoned their nuclear weapons program. Now, we did not know that at the time, but we know it now. And the reason that the Germans had abandoned their nuclear weapons program is because scientists in Germany believed that if the weapon was tested, that it would set off a fire in the atmosphere that would burn up the atmosphere, and the entire planet would be destroyed from the first test. So they took this information to Hitler, and Hitler said, we have to abolish the program because that's too dangerous. Hitler. That was Hitler. The U.S. has the same information, and they move forward. This is a historical fact. It's very unsettling, but it's entirely true. Okay. So the U.S. moves forward with their program anyway. By the time the test takes place, the Germans have surrendered. So can I make this clear again? At the Trinity test, the Germans have surrendered in the war. The war with Germany is over. The war with Japan is not over, but the war with Germany is over. American scientists are about 50-50 on this question. Will it set off a fire that destroys the world? And half of them think it will. And they test it anyway. So think about that. When they test the weapon, it doesn't set off the whole fire that destroys the world. So they build several more, and then they drop one, and then they drop another on 2 different cities. It's so cynical, and it's so dark, and it so goes against the narrative that Americans have about this war, right? So to give you a sense of what the film is like, so we go to the test site, so we go to the Trinity site. You can't actually go to the Trinity site except twice a year. There's weird events where they take tours and people take cameras and they take snapshots of the Trinity site. But when we're doing the road trip, we're not able to do that. So we get as close as we can. And as close as we can is the White Sands Missile Range. And the White Sands Missile Range is an incredibly bizarre place in New Mexico. Hold on. Let me find it here. Okay. There we go. Okay. Clean up. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Get rid of this. And here. Darn it. Why does it keep doing this to me? Okay. So we go to this site, and I've got the whole family with me. And it's a very, very windy day, and it's a very bizarre day, and this very apocalyptic looking place where where this sand is white. And this kind of gives you a sense of what the film is like. Okay, wait, sorry. Okay. That's my family. So you saw my little daughter, Matilda Jane, and she's very upset, right? And what's funny about this film is that she's the only person who was in the family who was, like, really upset all the time. Like, somehow she felt the vibe of everything. Like, the little guy is just living in his own little universe, and the teenager and my wife are used to all of my craziness. But she really felt the intensity of all this stuff. So this is where the film is at. It's like this intersection between domestic life and these stories. And then this last little image, which is hundreds and hundreds of these nuclear tests have been scanned and released by the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in the last 2 years. Because the U.S. not only tested this weapon that could have destroyed the world and then dropped it on 2 cities, but it also conducted 2,000 atmospheric tests. And so when we think about climate change, I've never heard anyone discuss what the relationship of climate change to 2,000 atmospheric tests of up to a megaton bomb that were done. So these are some of the kinds of things I'm trying to wrestle with in the film. So that's what I'm working on right now. I had like 10 times as much material that I was going to show you, and somehow I managed to talk too much, and so I'm sorry, but I also know we just have like very little time left, and so I want to be able to have a few questions and engage with you guys in a back and forth, and I'm sorry it's been so one-sided, but that's kind of where I'm going to begin. It's sort of in my formal presentation, and I guess we just have like a couple minutes left, but maybe a couple questions, and then I'm happy to hang out afterwards and talk to people too. So sorry I did so much talking. I guess I've just made too many movies. So yeah, how do we go now? What's the next phase? Do we need a mic? Oh yeah, I need to put my thing on here. We just have like 5-10 minutes, yeah. Okay.
That's good.
Oh, we have a good chunk of time. Good. Anybody have any questions?
Hi. Okay. It's okay. I can speak in
He's gonna ask
English.
in English. Okay, cool.
Thanks. So I wanted to ask you, when we were, I'm a student with Facundo.
Yeah.
So in class, it was mentioned that vision is the most important thing an author has or a filmmaker has. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think that your vision is permeated in your work, and how does that make you feel?
Yeah. For me, vision is like a very kind of specific and interesting idea. Generally, films it's difficult to identify the vision, right? They're made by a large group of people, and even a director with a strong identity is showing the films to test audiences, has producers involved, is working with an editor, right? There's these different levels, but I'm doing all of that, and again, it comes from a necessity. I just don't have any money, and so I take these different roles and do it myself. But what ends up happening is that my authorship of the film is very clear, right? So it is my vision, and it's my authorship, and it's my story. That can be a very dangerous thing, right? Because then it can become very selfish, self-absorbed, solipsistic. It can be disconnected from the world. It can be about one's own personal concerns and preoccupations. But I'm convinced that it can also be a way to look at the world more clearly. And what I mean by that is, so I talked about a film that I made about my own family's history and its racist past. And so by sharply and clearly looking at my own family history, paradoxically, I think that the film ends up resonating more broadly because it refers to so many other hidden pieces of violence, repressed history, secrets behind closed doors. You know, I just showed this fragment of the nuclear film, and the nuclear history of the U.S. is utterly forbidden in a way. Like no one, like I am going to have people in the U.S. hiss and boo at me when I tell the story about Hitler and the bomb. There's no getting around that. I'm waiting for it. It's coming. So there's something about, to me, that having a clarity of personal authorship that a long time ago, literature teachers told me that there's a strain. Like they gave me a quote from Chekhov, and I have the Russian playwright and short story writer, and I've searched for this quote ever since, and I don't know if it's a fictional quote or not. Okay, but the idea is still valid. And he said, "If you wish to attract the attention of the world, then describe your own tiny village in perfect detail." And there's something about this that is true. Similarly, if you wish to be critical of your society, you have to embed in your film self-criticism. Because otherwise people think of it as hypocrisy, they think of it as avoiding your reality. And so what I've found is that the more aggressively I am criticizing my own family history, myself, and my role in the world, I'm given a freedom to be critical towards the society in a way that I otherwise wouldn't get. So, for example, when I deal with the Vietnam War, my father's role in that war I'm very open about. And so that gives me an opportunity. So that's the way I see vision. I see vision as a way to make personal work that, instead of looking inward, paradoxically looks outward. By looking inward with such sharpness and such honesty, that I'm given a freedom to speak more critically, more broadly, and that's the way I think of vision.
Well, hi Travis, I got a question for you. At the beginning of your presentation, you said that in your family background, both of your parents were running from racism and war. Yeah. And then, like 25 minutes later, you said that the first time that you met Santiago Alvarez in Cuba was the first time that you decided to start making films. Yeah. And my question here for you is, which of these points defines the kind of person, filmmaker, and activist that you are right now? Right. I mean, it was the family background, it was the moment that you met for the first time Santiago Alvarez, or if there's any other moment that I didn't mention, I'd be pleased to hear it.
I think that they're all true. I don't really believe so much in like singularity. I think they all interconnect in these really interesting ways. I think a series of factors led me to become a filmmaker, but I didn't see them all at that time. I'll tell you one that's embarrassing but true, right? Which is that I was growing up in Montana, and I was, as a teenager, I became very interested in independent music. And I mean, I don't mean independent as a genre. I mean like musicians who were recording music themselves, making little records, and then going on tour in a crappy van, and playing little bars around the country and selling the records to people and the thing, right? I loved this. I thought it was so beautiful. It seemed so different from the culture that was being fed to me from above that I felt was very dishonest, right? And so at this time, like in 1982 or 83, REM was just getting started, and they're not the REM we think of now, right? They're not the giant arena band. They were a little independent band recording themselves. And they started producing music videos, and those music videos I would encounter, and those were the first experimental films I ever saw. So that is another influence of seeing these like beautiful, weird documents connected to the music, and then thinking about music as something that you could make yourself, you could teach yourself, and you could distribute yourself. Even before I had like radical ideas about politics, I just hated corporate culture. I just thought it was dishonest, and I didn't describe my life or my world, and it felt like bullshit to me. It still does. One of the things that drives me crazy about like this younger generation in the US is I think that there's like an acceptance of corporate culture that there was not when I was a teenager, where I think teenagers who were kind of edgier and weirder like I was naturally were hostile to it. And now like I have a 17-year-old daughter who thinks it's totally normal. Like she says, oh, you just like things because they're not popular. Like this is one of her obsessions, which isn't true at all, actually. It's just that stuff doesn't speak to me. And so that's another factor. And then another factor still was that, you know, when I first started encountering films and seeing these films of all sorts, like whatever, if you watch a film, it's hard to see the human hand behind a Hollywood film. Right? It's hard to see an individual voice that created that, at least for me. Maybe it's easier for other people to see. But when I watch Hollywood films, they seem like films made by an institution. They seem like giant corporate, you know, products. And so I went to a few experimental film festivals, and I could see films made by people. I could see like an individual made this film and came up with an idea. So I think seeing Santiago, I think having this family history, I think seeing work connected to independent music, and I think seeing films that were made by individuals and seeing that they could express themselves very clearly, all of those were factors that intersected. And then I just wanted to be creative. I mean, I was inclined towards creativity. I loved music, and I couldn't figure out how to play an instrument. And so, you know, film became like my instrument, and it became a way for me to make music. So all of these are different factors that contributed and created a kind of critical mass. And then, of course, just good luck. I mean, that's always a factor, too. I mean, I probably wouldn't be standing here answering your question if the guy in front of me at the ice cream parlor hadn't asked me if I wanted to meet anybody. And that's a little scary, right? Like it's a little, because then you feel like, well, what opportunities didn't happen because I didn't meet the guy at the ice cream parlor? And I'm sure there have been many. So all of those would be factors involved in it.
Thank you, Travis.
Thank you.
Hi, Travis. First of all, I very impressed of how much I can relate to your story. You and I share the same last name. My last name is Wilkerson,
Really?
and that side, yeah.
That's already
that's-
really unusual,
no,
so
no.
I'm kind of shocked.
That side of my family is
Yeah.
really, really racist.
Yeah.
And I identify myself to that part of life when you have a part of your family that
Yeah.
has some old ideas.
Yeah.
So the question is more personal. How
Yeah.
do you deal with people that's racist
Yeah.
and don't want to change their vision?
It's an incredibly difficult thing. I mean, I think the first thing is again this inward gaze. You make that decision yourself, and you make it what your identity is. You don't let your family determine, right? So, like, I have these parents who rejected, but everybody else in the family still held. I mean, even now they still hold on to these ideas. And I think, like, family is a very complicated thing. Like, it's a complicated thing, and I guess you understand this. So there's this film by the Japanese director Ara Kazuo. I don't know if anyone knows this filmmaker, but he made this incredible documentary in the 1980s called The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. Does anyone know this film? Is this a film you see down here? Okay. It's a fascinating and bizarre film that I highly recommend you all immediately go try to find. And he follows a guy who is a Japanese man who is a very traumatized World War II veteran who has been so traumatized by his experience in the war that he obsessively attacks the people he thinks sent him to the war. So he's obsessed, it's a real story, and he's obsessed with the emperor, and he tries to go after the emperor. He literally distributes fake pornography about the emperor. He builds a giant van that has slogans denouncing the emperor, and he drives it around Japan. I mean, it's a very crazy film. And then at a certain point in the film, he begins to confront all of the military officers who were above him in the war, and basically, as an elderly man, beats the crap out of them on camera. It's an extremely bizarre film. Okay. Early in the film, he goes on this tirade. He's asked to preside over a wedding, to be the officiant, like to be the person who asks the questions and presides over the wedding. And then he says something really crazy, right? He says, as he's conducting a wedding, he says, families are a way to keep people apart from each other. They're just like countries. They divide people. And I remember watching this, and it really shook me up. And I thought, that's not the way we talk about family, right? Like, everyone always says that family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. Your family is the most wonderful thing, right? But I kept thinking about that there's something truthful in what he's saying, that family can work kind of like a nation can work in the worst sense of nationalism. Like, I think of nationalism in the U.S. as a catastrophic impulse right now, white nationalism, a catastrophic presence in the U.S., right? So then if family at the smallest level is doing the same thing that nation is, dividing us from one another, thinking that we have less in common, well, what do we do with family? I increasingly believe that family is who we choose to regard as family. So it's not about genetics, it's not about who's born into our family, but it's who affirms us, who supports us, who loves us, who helps us to be a better person as opposed to a worse person, and that we can choose that to some extent. And I know this is selective, but it's something I have decided to do. So, for example, I don't really regard SE branches in my family. Like, I use it in the context of a film, it's a useful device, but I don't feel... And I'm aware of the burden that is on me from him, and I want to respond to it, but I'm not responsible for his violence. I'm responsible for my conduct moving forward, and I'm responsible for my behavior in the world. And so that's the main thing I would say. The way that we're going to convince them is through our behavior and through the way that we live our lives, and that we're going to demonstrate the superiority of believing in commonality and believing in community. And my belief is, in a way, that many of you in this room are more in my family than SE branches in my family, because of these fundamental differences that I have broken with. And so I would just urge you to do the same thing. In terms of, like, convincing people, it's very hard, right? So this film about Alabama, 3 months ago, something weird happened, which is that a relative I'd never met wrote me an email, and she'd seen the film, and she said, I'm so unsettled by this film, and this is our family together, and so then she started showing the movie to other members of my family in Alabama who had not seen it, didn't know about it, and all that happened was that they got angry. And they all turned against each other. And there was a family reunion, apparently, where there were fist fights and all kinds of craziness right now. So what does that mean? It means that there are some people so entrenched in their value system that we can never lift them out. So we need to find space with those who are sitting in a different place. We need to offer models to people who are conflicted, and we need to propose different ideas for them, and we need to accept that certain members of our family are going to continue to hold on to these hateful ideas, and that ultimately we're not responsible for them if we are this other presence in the world. That's a positive, progressive presence. It isn't a complete solution, but it's an inadequate solution, but it's the only solution I think we have. I mean, how do we ever confront people who deal with us in total opposition? You know, in the U.S. right now, we have just like everything is divided into two. Like, I mean, everybody is like pro-Trump or anti-Trump, and there's right, and everybody is convinced of their, and it's like there is no discussion, there's no discourse, there's no possibility of movement. There's also no ability to sort of be anti-Trump from a position that doesn't embrace the Democratic Party. Right? This is like this huge problem in the U.S. right now. Is that the things that I care the most about, racism and war. I mean, the Democrats are just as bad as Trump, honestly. I mean, the Democrats have been a warlike party. You know, like I got into this ridiculous social media fight with someone who said, well, the Republicans start all the wars, and I was like, yeah, except for World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and the Korean War. Right? And so, but somehow when we're stuck in this duality of the world, there's only this and there's only this, then we're not. I remember this other thing. There's this radical writer named Alexander Cockburn, who passed away a couple of years ago, told this funny story. He said that growing up in Ireland in World War II, that everybody would say the same thing. They'd say, if you said that you opposed the war effort, if you were opposed to World War II in some sense, then people would say, oh, I guess you want your sister to get raped by a Nazi. And he'd say, isn't there another option? Like, those are the only two options, And I think like this, to push towards some kind of critical perspective that it's what I said earlier, that if we need new ways to express radical ideas in order for those radical ideas to be received, we also need new ways to criticize and new perspectives that don't just fit into the standard existing sort of scheme. And that's about family too, I think. So it's a great challenge to convince those who are opposed to us. But mostly I think we need to convince people who are nearer to us to keep struggling, to keep fighting, and to keep doing the right thing. I think that's more important than trying to convince our enemies to magically come to our side. So even if those enemies are in our family. Sorry, I don't have a good answer. It's a very difficult problem.
It's okay.
From one Wilkerson to another.
Hi. As a filmmaker, artist, father, and human, what advice can you give us to all of us?
Well, I mean, I know this is going to sound strange, but just keep moving forward with everything. I mean, I think that where everything falls apart is despair. And despair is extremely easy to succumb to as an artist, as a father, as a filmmaker. Like, there are so many reasons to succumb to despair. And despair is dishonest, right? Because it's not that there are not despairing things in the world, and God knows I wrestle with them all the time. But the world is also such a beautiful place, and if we are only seeing the darkness, then we are not seeing the beauty, and they coexist in a very powerful way, right? And so that's true of all of the things that I just said. So like, being an artist is one of the most challenging and exhausting things that one can do. But it's also the most beautiful way of life you can ever live. I cannot express this to you enough. When all of you are feeling frustrated in a year or two, and you don't feel like you have the job opportunities that you should have, and you're not getting the money to make your work, and people aren't showing your work, just keep moving forward. Just keep moving forward. Do not succumb to that despair. Being a parent is one of the most exhausting and challenging things in the world. But if you are paying attention and you're awakened to the beauty of the world, being a parent is also the most wonderful thing you will ever do. So all of these things are interconnected. It's about awakening your senses to the world and being open to a multiplicity of things at the same time, but always being aware of the beauty that exists all around us, even in the most horrible times. Because I'm telling you, it is always there. And so that's what I would say. And it's also just like, just keep moving forward. Just keep moving forward. When I look at who, to speak specifically as an artist, I went to graduate school. After I made my early films, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. And the only way that I could be a teacher is to have a Master's of Fine Arts. And so I went to graduate school and went to film school after I became a filmmaker, which is kind of a weird path. And I went to Cal Arts. And so when I got into that graduate school, I had a class of 20 people. So 20 people were in that class with me in the Masters of Fine Arts at a school in the United States that's regarded as a top 5 graduate school. So it's a prestigious program. And now it's been 21 years since I went to that program. And of the 20 of us who started together, I would say 4 of us are still filmmakers. So 16 people who got a Masters of Fine Arts from the most prestigious avant-garde school in the U.S., certainly a top 5 film school. 16 of them have abandoned practice, and 4 of them are still making films. I'm going to be really clear here. The 4 were not the most talented. Like, we were not. We didn't give up. That is the only difference. The difference is persisting and struggling and not giving up. One by one, each of those 16 people succumbed to very human frustration and despair and moved on. And the 4 of us who are still making films are the 4 of us who just wouldn't give in. We were just stubborn. And so I'd say that is the most important thing. Just if you mean it, and if you're here because this is your life's calling, don't let anyone stop you. And if you don't let anyone stop you, you will not be stopped.
Hi, thank you. You almost already answered my question, but how do you deal? I mean, where do you get the strength from whenever you feel despair, or like your work? It's like a lot of people are going to have already told you to stop, or try to. When that happens to you, how do you work with that, and how do you reconnect? Trying to to write again, or to do, I don't know, how do you get this, where did you get the strength from?
Well, I mean, I think I had really beautiful models and parents who continued through difficulty. They weren't creative people, but they continued through profound difficulties. And so I kind of grew up in a family where giving up was regarded as a very great error. I mean, my dad would always have this attitude, like he would just lots of people in families have great insults, but to my dad, quitter was it was bad, right? But for me, it's now perspective, because when I showed this little fragment of Who Killed Cock Robin, and that was my quitting moment, right? That was the moment where I came the closest to quitting, and where I wanted to quit. It is, like I said, it's impossible to describe what it's like to have your most humiliating moments unfolding in an entirely public context. Like, it's a very specific thing. But now that I have the perspective of that, and I had this, it's funny because I thought about this just yesterday, actually. I was like, imagine my life today if my only films were An Injury to One and Who Killed Cock Robin, right? Like, I thought about this, right? Imagine if I were now looking back, and I just can feel how awful I would feel about my life, like how defeated I would feel. And so having that perspective, for me now, it's just like moving forward is kind of easy, like, because it's become habit. Anything that we do often enough becomes habit, and creativity for me is habit now. So when I was first developing practice, I would go through long processes where I would have writer's block, or I couldn't solve a problem, but I've been doing it for 25 years now, and so now the practice has become, I know what my process is. So like when I hit a wall, I always do the same thing. I do busy work that relates to the project, And then that always gets me back to the creativity. So that's my simple solution. So like if I'm doing an edit and I'm like, I just can't figure out how these two images fit together, or I don't know what music to use, or what I always do is the same thing. I just go do busy work. I type that transcript, or I send off that grant application, or something like that. Like I do something banal that's not creative. And somehow through the banality, I always get back to the creativity. It always starts making me daydream. And I start going, oh, wait a minute. Here's the song that would work for that. Like it always has this effect. How I did it back then, I'm not entirely sure. But what I can tell you is that if you can learn anything from me today, it's that if I had abandoned my practice, I would be so despairing now. So when you're having that moment, remember that, and remember that it's like, okay, he said this, and I can't do it. Like I can't, because I don't know anything, but I know that would be a disaster in my life right now. And everyone I know who made those decisions, they look back on the period when they're creative as the most important and the most vibrant and the most meaningful, no matter how hard it was. And so I just can't let myself do it at this point. And now I don't have any other skills. So like at this point I have, like I don't have, like every so often I'll be like, what could I do if I didn't do filmmaking, like so that my family can have more stability and we could have like a good retirement account or whatever. And then I'm just like, I don't know how to do anything. Like I don't have any normal skills, you know. And so every so often I'll apply for jobs and I don't get them anyway, so it works out fine. You know, and again, this like makes, again, it's hard to explain. Day-to-day life is challenging as an artist. It is. There's no getting around it. But it is more than a job. It is your identity. It is your calling. It is profound. It is like, I guess it's what people who go into the priesthood and want to be priests, something like that. I don't know what it is, but it's a profound calling, and life is so much more meaningful. And the main thing about it that's so beautiful is that being an artist is, I think human beings are incredibly social. I think I think capitalism tries to teach us to be antisocial in a million different ways every single day. But fundamentally, what we arose as a species because we had the ability to communicate and work together and solve problems together. And being an artist is the most social thing you can do. Like to the point where sometimes you're like, oh, you know, like I mean, this is like, I don't know, my 10th public speaking thing in the last couple of weeks, right? And there's times when I'm like, oh, I'm saying the same crap and I'm exhausted and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to be in front of people again. But then I feel so connected to human beings, and I feel so grateful for that. Like at a time when everybody is feeling so disconnected from one another, I'm constantly given an opportunity to be connected with other people, and that makes me feel so human, and it makes me deal better with my children, and it makes me, I don't know, it's just profound. So that's the way. It's just use it as a way to connect with others and have faith that if it's something you believe in, you absolutely can do it if you stick with it, and just struggle through it.
Hello.
Right there.
I want to say thank you. Your thoughts are very inspiring to me, and I want to share my work. I'm an actress, I'm not a filmmaker,
Okay.
but I had the need to tell a story.
Sure.
It was also a story of my parents.
Okay.
I'm daughter of a hippie family that they left Germany, they are German, they went to Africa, they lived there,
Wow.
and ended up on the Canary Islands.
Okay.
This island where I was born, El Hierro, is very small, and all the people that are different and think different, they are like criticized
Right.
very hardly. I left the island as soon as I could, and then I studied for acting and everything.
Okay.
And one day I really felt the need to tell a story, but I didn't know what to tell.
Right.
So I bought a camera, I went to Africa and tried to find all the places where my parents lived and those friends.
Yeah.
And there I realized that I was a little bit of African culture,
Yeah.
a little bit of German culture, and a little bit of Spanish culture, and all that together, that was what I was.
Yeah.
So in the end, I didn't know what to tell in my story, but I found that what I needed to tell is that we are all the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where we live, and that racism doesn't make sense.
Right.
So today, listening to your words was really inspiring. I want to say thank you, because what I've done really made sense. I felt that it came from a place very deep inside of myself,
Right.
and I didn't know what would be the end of what I was going to tell, but I found it while I was doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's really beautiful. And the journey is a big part of it. I mean, I think one thing when one is working on individual projects, I think somehow when we're first learning to make things, we think we know what we wish to say before, at the beginning of it, and we don't need to. And actually when we think, I don't know what I want to do, the stepping forward and taking the camera and having the conversations, that's when we discover the way to articulate it. And I find that I'm very comfortable with not knowing where I'm going to end up with because I've been doing it for so long, right? But I can understand why when one is first beginning, that seems overwhelming, and we think, of course, everyone must know their whole idea all the way through. That journey is an incredibly important part of the process, though, and actually really beautiful. Is something, maybe it's a high wire act, you know, we're walking on a high wire, but it's a beautiful thing to do, and it always resolves itself. If we keep going, it always resolves itself. And this question of dividing us up, you know, I've been thinking about it so much this last couple of weeks because I just love Mexico and I love Mexican people. I just feel so deeply connected, right? I just always have a wonderful time here, and so I found myself wondering again, where does anti-Mexican racism, like embodied by people, like where does it even come from? Like this Trumpian bullshit, like what are the origins of it even? Like it's so baffling to me because when I'm in Mexico, I feel not only this, I also feel like a place where culture has developed over thousands of years, and you feel this wisdom of this long distance, and then all this commingling of different cultures that you say that have formed, you know, just like your own experience, but it's completely embodied in Mexico, right? Where a series of different cultures have intersected to produce this remarkably vibrant society. So where does all this shit come from? I almost feel like the reason Trump hates Mexicans is because Mexicans are so awesome. And he's just such a useless piece of shit, you know what I mean? I mean this sincerely. This division is a false division, and it's stupid, and of course it's wrong, but I also don't even understand where the hell it comes from. But it's also the same thing in the US, right? I mean, like, imagine American culture without black people, right? Like, imagine American culture without black people. Can you imagine what American music would be like if there were no African roots to US society? You know, like, it's just fascinating. Like, so many vibrant, beautiful things about American culture come from the places in America, from the people who have created the patchwork of American culture. Another thing I think about is, like, what would American food be like if there hadn't been a strong Latin American presence in U.S. food? Like, it would be terrible. It would be awful. And the more cultures that intersect and connect, something beautiful that is produced that's like this wonderful magic. So what is racism anyway? Obviously, it was a rationalization for slavery and for the extermination of the indigenous population. But beyond that, it's just baffling to me. I don't understand where it even comes from, and I feel like that's some sort of weird reflection of what you're talking about. So, anyway, I'm very confused by racism.
Gracias. Well, this is none of my business, but I want to know what happened with your parents. I mean, are they still married?
Okay,
Are they living in Butte?
Sure.
And how do you feel about your work?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
another
sure.
question.
Yeah, sure.
After 2003 and what happened at Sundance with your movie,
Yeah.
how did you make a living?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I always think about this
Yeah.
in terms of other filmmakers, like
Yeah.
they stop working for a couple of years
Right,
or
right,
something, but
right.
about your personal
Yeah.
situation,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
did you make a living?
I'll answer that first, and then I'll go with my parents. So I shot the film in 2003, but it premiered at 2005, and it was, as I said, catastrophic. By, again, complete kind of happenstance, like at the moment when I was in an absolute crisis, a former teacher of mine reached out to me and said, would you be interested in teaching a class? And so so for that next several years, I just taught. I was a teacher, and I didn't produce any more films for almost 5 years. I was doing a little bit of performance art, but it was just not for money, believe me. It was the opposite of for money. But I was doing a little bit of that, but I was teaching. And for me, that sort of handing off, the teaching was just a miracle. I mean, it was like it came into my lap accidentally in the most beautiful moment, and then learning to do that. So then I got into the classroom that fall, and it was at CalArts, which is a very good school, and the money wasn't that good, but it was enough to pay my basic living expenses and survive. And then what I find over and over again with teaching is that this question before about what do you do when you feel the despair. The thing about teaching and despair, in my opinion, is that somehow teaching always works against despair, because in the classroom, you're trying to help young artists solve problems that you've solved previously. That's the main thing you're doing. And somehow in the process of that, of bringing work you believe in, showing it, arguing for it, and arguing through a set of kind of solutions to the problems they're confronting, the despair tends to fall away. And so it was through the teaching that I went back into my practice, because I was helping them make work, and even though I didn't make work for a few years, it reactivated my desire to make work because I was helping these young artists make work. And a bunch of them are really, really amazing now. There's one of the neat things about teaching at a place like CalArts, which I only got to do for a little while, is the students are really serious and they're really ambitious, and so you're working with people who are really trying to make significant works, and that just helped me through it. In terms of my parents were together to the very end. My mom is still alive. My dad passed away a couple of years ago, and it actually relates to all this. So my father, who was obsessed with the war, in a way that was very destructive for him in many ways. I think it never really ended, and I think he never forgave himself, which I think is unfortunate. So his life ended in a way that was like the only way it could end, which is that he contracted a form of cancer that was related to Agent Orange exposure in the war. And so he then spent 2 years with this terminal disease called multiple myeloma, which is a rare form of blood cancer, and had just a terrible last couple of years of his life. And when he was going through it, he was very conscious of its relationship to the war. And his very last words for me was, "Why did they make me fight that terrible war? Why did they do this to me?" Right? And that's, I'm very sad that he ended his life with so much despair, but in a way, he lived his whole life that way about the war, and so if I would have imagined how he would die one day, it's probably how I would have imagined it. I really feel like, in a way, his consciousness imposed the cancer on him as much as the chemicals did. I know that sounds strange, but I always felt that way, because he felt that he had done this terrible, terrible thing, and I spent years simultaneously talking to him about, and I truly hate the Vietnam War. I think it's just horrific. I cannot believe that Americans still believe that this neo-colonial savagery that murdered millions of people to prevent a country from gaining independence was somehow appropriate. But nonetheless, somehow, he was a soldier. He wasn't the one who went to war. He was the one who was sent to war. It's always the people in business suits, someplace else, who send young people off to the terrible wars. And so I always felt like he needed to figure out a way where he could be critical of the war but could forgive himself, and he never could. My mom is the same. She's still a complete maniac. So the whole time I was doing the film about Alabama, she was like instigating me and sending me articles and encouraging things and telling me to take it further. Now that I'm working on the nuclear war film, literally every day she sends me an article that's some sort of apocalyptic article about nuclear war. So she's still very much the same way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. It's on again, yeah.
Hi. You were talking about all these nuclear spots in the States.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you, what do you think is the main purpose of the States to have all this nuclear stuff?
Yeah.
You think it's only to show off power or to provoke fear in other countries? What do you think?
I think it's an existential question for the U.S. I think it's different for different countries, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the U.S. is the country that created the weapon. And what I mean by that is that the U.S. is a country that was created through a kind of form of aggression, right? It came to a place, it seized land, and then continued to expand the seizure of land. And it did that through slave labor. These are basic existential questions. But the fundamental notion that what is ours, and I mean this ironically, and I'm talking about the U.S., came through seizing things violently, has created a kind of culture in the U.S. that permanently believes that everybody wants what we have and will do to us what we did to them. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it creates a kind of identity about violence, which I think is deeply interconnected to the amount of sexual violence against women in U.S. society, to the amount of gun violence that unfolds constantly in U.S. society, and to something else about the U.S., which is that I believe that there's only been 13 years in U.S. history when the U.S. hasn't been at war with someone, like in 250 years or something like that. Well, why is that? It's because, again, it's this kind of existential and defining thing that we see violence as something that led to our creation, that led to our power. And then the other thing is, how did the U.S. rise from a minor power to a major power, right? World War I took the U.S. from a minor position to a significant position, and World War II lifted the U.S. into the dominant position in the world, along with the Soviet Union at that time. And so whether it's seizing the land to begin with, expanding land into the American West, or then rising to a position of prominence in the world, it's always been connected to warfare, and so it sees the whole world that way. The thing that's so weird about the nuclear stuff is, like, so I've known this my whole life. My mom got into, like, anti-nuclear war stuff back in the nuclear freeze period in the 1980s, which is why I know about all this stuff and was interested in it. So I knew the numbers, and I knew how many weapons there were, and, like, I knew that each of those missile silos has, like, the equivalent of, 30 or 40 Hiroshima bombs in a single missile, and then there's hundreds of them, and then there's thousands of other weapons. I knew all of that. But when you do what I just did, which I didn't expect, driving through the West and coming back around, the scale of the infrastructure, not just of warfare, right? Because the U.S. has, like, something like 150 international military bases. I mean, like, right? That's already just insane. Like, how in the world did this become an acceptable reality that a single country can have military bases in hundreds of places around the world? And people think of that as a completely normal thing, both in the U.S. and abroad. But then you drive around and you look at the scale of this, and you're looking at the scale of apocalyptic warfare. You're looking at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of places where those weapons wouldn't just be destructive to the city they're dropped on, they would be destructive to the planet. They would end life on Earth. So how does the vastness of this infrastructure become normality, become acceptable, and then more than that, become a pretext for the U.S. to decide who else can have the weapons? So the U.S. gets to decide. The U.S. ushers in this nightmare to the world, and then that, instead of giving, that should have just destroyed the U.S.'s credibility to ever decide who else gets the weapons. Instead, it's had the opposite effect. Again, it has something to do with an existential question about where does the U.S. come from, and where did its power arise, and then does it now treat everyone else the same way? There's this. So I didn't get to talk about this, but for the person of some German extraction, there's this these two filmmakers in East Germany who were called Heinowski and Scheumann. They were the most significant East German documentary filmmakers, and their work is largely erased from film history because they are connected with the East German regime in terms of people's assessments of them. But they didn't make films about East Germany. They made films about the U.S., and I find them very interesting. And they made this one film in 1967 called Pilots in Pajamas, and it's a 5-hour film in which U.S. prisoners of war in the Hanoi Hilton, so the prison camp in Hanoi, are interviewed about why they went to war and why they were dropping bombs on Vietnam. Okay. It's a very interesting film, and as the son of a military pilot in the war, I find it incredibly fascinating, right? And this is a film that every American should watch, but no Americans have watched. It is basically banned in the U.S., and you can't really see it. And there's this one moment in the film that I think helps to explain this. It's a section about torture, okay, which is a very American thing, right? The U.S. has been connected to this vast infrastructure of torture with academies and institutions and manuals, and it's a huge, vast system, right? There's no question about that. And so in the film, the filmmakers are asking one of these Americans, they ask each of them in a row. They describe the training that the pilots go through before they go to Vietnam. And one of the training that they go through is that they're tortured. And they're tortured to prepare to be tortured. Okay, so this is the idea, is they're training them so they won't betray as they're being tortured. And so they go through the list of all the different things the ways they're tortured. And they're going through the list that it includes electrocution and waterboarding and all, I don't need to go through all this barbarism, but you can imagine they go through the list. And they ask them, were you trained for this? Yes. Were you waterboarded when you were captured? No. Were you trained for this? Yes. Did that happen to you? No. And they go, it's this long sequence in the film. And then the East German filmmakers who are very critical of the U.S. say, well, why do you think you were trained to do all these things that you didn't experience? And the pilots are like, it's like a lot of the pilot questions are like, I don't know, like over and over again, they seem kind of confused by the questions. And then the filmmakers say, well, I would propose to you that it's because your country demonizes socialism so much that you can only imagine that socialists would do these terrible things to you and prepare you for this. And that's where the filmmakers get it wrong. They don't take it far enough. That's not why they do that. They are preparing the pilots to be subjected to the things that they will subject others to. And that's the answer about violence and war. I'm sorry to say.
Thanks.
Hi, so I wanted to ask you if have you ever dealt with censorship because of your ideas of filmmaking? Because, well, not all the people all the time share the same ideas.
Yeah.
And, well, my family is from Cuba, and I studied in the film school.
Yeah.
And before I lived there, my mom told me, do not talk about the government, do not talk about your radical ideas there. Right. And I think that's all around the world.
Yeah.
And even in that type of country. So have you ever dealt with censorship?
Yeah. The primary form of censorship that unfolds in the U.S., and it's not the only form, but the primary form is economic censorship. So, for example, I'm unemployed right now. And despite having a lot of experience teaching and having made 17 films. And so I don't get opportunities. I don't get grants that I would normally get for what I've achieved. I don't get financing opportunities. That's the primary way that censorship works in the U.S. is that there's a kind of an attempt to grind you down through frustration and despair that you'll give in. So that's the primary way that in which I've had to confront it. Actual governmental censorship is a really fascinating and complex thing, right? Because economic censorship and sort of open censorship or legal censorship are very different. And one of the things that happens in so let's think of an example of a country like Iran. And Iran has an extremely vibrant cinema, but it also has a very formal censorship system. Okay, so like literally you have to have your script approved in advance, and then you have to have the cut approved afterwards, and to get distribution you have to get further approval. There's a series of these censorship boards. And that's the way it's operated in most countries where there's formal censorship. That would be typical of the former socialist bloc and all of the countries that have their same economic model. But what's interesting about that form of censorship is that it paradoxically encourages a form of critical practice that is very clever, that evades the censorship, right? So like some people have described it like it's like a ski race where they put slalom poles and you have to go around the poles, right? And so Iranian cinema is extremely critical, but it's critical in these very clever ways. Like it's so, for example, a story about the status of women would usually be depicted by having a story about children. So it's hidden underneath children. So it's, and then it's in fact about the status of women, but it's depicted through the status of young girls, right? In the former socialist bloc, it would operate the same way. You'd see these very sophisticated, complex forms of criticism, but embedded in these like ways of going around. In the U.S., that operates very differently. Because the forms of censorship are economic, people are not cleverly evading this way. They're simply avoiding criticism altogether, and they're just finding ways to sort of appeal to the corporate forces because the rules are established in a different way. So I think overall I have encountered less formal censorship than I might imagine, but the consequences for me have been pretty profound, and I am definitely denied economic opportunities that I would normally have for my family and for me and my work. But, I knew what I was getting into. I made my own bed, so I definitely never imagined that I would have a lot of those opportunities to begin with. And honestly, when I started on this process, I really never thought it was going to be a life's calling anyway. So that's kind of the way, I would say that in a very strange way that trying to navigate the economic censorship, which is, in many, many countries in the world, it's a very difficult thing to navigate. Because how do you express criticism when the kind of parameters of your criticism are not established, and when there's not like There's not like one person there's not like a censor who's sitting there and looking at things that you're trying to outwit. You're trying to sort of somehow produce an idea that people think could make money. And one thing I know about my films is that no matter how widely they're seen, they make no money. I mean, they just do not make money. And so, so I endlessly am confronting the same thing, which is that people will not give me the opportunities that I would normally get because their argument is, well, that's not going to make any money. And I don't really have a quick answer for that because I don't really disagree with them. The last film that I made was the first film that sales agents contacted me. And sales agents are really in many ways the power players in cinema right now. They're the ones who determine where films get shown and then where films get distributed. And so having a relationship with a sales agent is very important, and I've never had one. And over again, we would have these conversations where they would say, oh, I like the film very much, but we're never going to be able to sell it. And I would get very frustrated because I would say, look, don't you think you're determining that in advance? Like perhaps if you simply made an effort to sell this kind of work, there actually would be an audience for this kind of work. And then they would kind of look at me with blank faces and say, well, anyway, we can't sell it. And so I would move on. But then what's interesting is that the film got so much press and so much attention in the U.S., which is really unusual for my work. And its entire domestic gross was $24,000. So it made no money. The movie didn't cost very much, but it cost slightly more than that, and it made no money. And at that moment, I was like, well, that's an interesting question, because it seems like those sales agents were actually correct, even though I was frustrated with them, because those who finally chose to distribute it didn't make any money, which raises a different question, which is perhaps the mechanism to overcome economic censorship is for us to create structures of distribution that are as creative as the structures of production. And so that's going to kind of become a burden on filmmakers, that they need to create new ideas for how to distribute the work in the world. And I think that's a pressing matter for progressive, innovative filmmakers. But there's only so many hours in the day, and it's already hard to get the work made and to sort all that out and to survive and then to figure out. Because what I fear is that if I then spent like 2 years after finishing a film trying to distribute the film, I just think my practice would come to a halt, and so I never end up doing it, and the films don't show as widely as they show, as they should. So those are difficult questions. I wish there were some really creative person in here who could create like an alternative economic model for distribution, which I think is going to happen. I think the current system is falling apart. I don't think it's making any sense anymore, and even the studios are, they're mimicking the whole economy, right? It's the 1%, 99% thing, where you have 1% of films are making massive amounts of money, and then none of the other films are making any money at all. So this is a huge problem that we're all going to be confronting, but there has to be a way to outwit this. I just am not smart enough to figure out what it is.
Sorry, Travis over here. Yep.
Sorry. Oh, okay. I see it. Yeah.
I'm making this question in Spanish in case I can find the right words. So yes, sorry. Okay. Yep. ¿Cómo o qué procesos creativos o quizá técnicos tienes para, o no sé, empleas para transformar estos discursos tan fuertes, tan críticos en las imágenes? O sea, que no se vuelvan como pesados, o sea, que sean, pues sí, o sea, para transmitirlos correctamente, porque son discursos como muy importantes, muy fuertes. Entonces quizá es algo complicado transformarlo a imágenes o a películas, vaya.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really nice question. I'm convinced that there's a way in which, for all that I'm sitting here talking about all these ideas and making these complex arguments, that in a way it's pushing towards simplicity, right? Like, I know that is a counterintuitive thing. How does one create complexity? But you create complexity actually through simplicity. I think that we tend to think that in order to convey our meaning, there's a very grand idea that is associated with the cinema, and one of the things that I often encounter with people, especially young filmmakers, is that they say they don't want to make simple films; they want to make cinematic films. And it's always a term that I kind of find frustrating, because I really think what they mean is they want to make a film that looks more like what they think of as cinema, which is really a different thing altogether. To me, the main way to convey complexity is through having a very direct gaze, right? So, you know, I showed a little piece of Cock Robin, and Cock Robin is like the camera's moving and everything's... I moved away from that after that because I was convinced that what I want to do with my films is I want to create an opportunity for us to look at ourselves a little bit more clearly. And the way that we look at ourselves more clearly is to look at ourselves with kind of more slowness and directness and like face to face. And so like I try to make images kind of piece by piece by piece. I try to set the camera up in a place that I think expresses something, and then I do very little to it. And I want it to unfold in front of it. And I want the image to have strength. I've always been interested in still photography, and so I look at a lot of photographers and what I think are strong about their images. And usually it's about looking at something for a little bit longer than we normally look at things in a film, and listening to something a little bit longer, and then trying to intervene with words. I know it's going to sound strange because I talk so much, but actually trying to intervene with words as little as possible and somehow create the kind of alchemic force through that long gaze, that long sound, and then the words that activate the relationship between those two things. I also think that, you know, all the early, very innovative filmmakers were thinking about montage. And montage is a wonderful thing to think about, and I think it's powerful. But I'm also thinking in terms of how usually when we take an image and we combine it with a sound, and then we combine it with a word. So like if, let's say we take an image and we combine it with a sound, then all of a sudden there's a third meaning. We have an image, we have a sound, and then a third meaning that comes from the collision of those two things. And then when we add a word, we don't have a fourth meaning, but we have an infinite number of meanings. And so that's the way in which I try to create the complexity, is having a kind of simple image and a simple sound that combined create a new meaning, and then choose words that then intervene on that combined meaning to create a multiplicity of meanings. That's at least what I'm striving to do. I really think simplicity actually is a great sign. I'm always convinced that I have made something strong when somehow I've conveyed my meaning through something relatively simple. Yeah, that's a good place to stop. Can I just finish up and say this is just such a wonderful honor, and I really appreciate all of the conversation, and thank you so much for taking my work so seriously, and I look forward to seeing the amazing films that you make down the road and teach me about filmmaking.